just as last week, whatever you want to write down below, in the blank space of the prompt, you certainly are welcome to. On the back of the prompt is rubric. I did do some things to hopefully maybe clarify some points with it. So you might want to take a quick little look at that. One of the things that I made sure to emphasize within the evidence and commentary, really the commentary part, summarizes the evidence but does not explain how the evidence supports the significance of the work as a whole. You'll see this phrase, significance of the work as a whole, show up in the prompt as well as showing up in the rubric. So a big part of the commentary points that's going to go along with that evidence is you want to make sure that you consistently explain how that evidence that you're going to highlight is supporting the significance to the work as a whole. Also down below in the sophistication area. And again, the idea is that we're not going with this rubric, but we're going to go back with the traditional one that we've been using, or the scoring at least. I shouldn't say the rubric, but the score points. Is I added this statement, which is obviously specific to the prompt, that wouldn't be showing up on just any kind of AP thing, but recognizing the impact of Salinger's purpose and argument in relation to the audience and time period. Now again, it's not saying that this is something that has to get done along with 1 through 4, but that would be a point of emphasis that would help you pick up that sophistication point. One of the things I talked about yesterday, when we pass back the DRQs and whatnot, the TWAs with the sophistication point, is like, how's that argument going to be relevant in today's world? That's not something that I really want you to focus on for this, because you're dealing with a book that gets published in 1951. You're dealing with a 1950 audience. It's not that Salinger is trying to communicate something to Shea in 2019. Maybe he is, but we're not going to assume that that's the case. So you're still going to be establishing the impact. You're still going to be taking a look at the relevance, the sophistication of the argument, but you taking a look at what's going on within that time period and what's going on with the audience, the intended audience or a potential intended audience, is going to be a big way of getting that sophistication point for you. So within the prompt itself, if there were a key phrase that I would look at, it would certainly be this: explain the significance of the madness to the work as a whole, because that's something that could potentially begin a domino effect that would work in your favor to kind of maximize what those points ultimately would be. This is kind of a little bit different, because in some ways you're doing a DRQ argument and you're still doing literary analysis at the same time, which isn't anything that you're going to be doing on an actual AP exam, but since it's about a book that we've read, you're going to be doing some analysis for the book. So there's certainly some DRQ elements, but there's also some analysis as to what's the author attempting to do. You don't have to worry about rhetorical devices, though. You don't have to kind of blend those things where partway through your DRQ, let's take a look at the diction now, and things like that. You might make a reference to something being symbolic, but you don't have to worry about that so far as, crafting a dibbles and a spa and all that kind of stuff. So, wording of it, and then we can kind of go over what might be some concerns or questions about the wording. One definition of madness is mental delusion or the eccentric behavior arising from it, but Emily Dickinson wrote, "Much madness is divine sense to a discerning eye." Novelists and playwrights have often seen madness with a discerning eye. J.D. Salinger is no different, as Holden Caulfield's apparent madness or irrational behavior plays an important role in the novel's development. Write a well-organized essay rationalizing how Holden's delusion or eccentric behavior may or may not be judged as reasonable. Then explain the significance of the madness to work as a whole. Got some mouth moving and this kind of look, and Libby's just, we don't know where Libby is right now.
I don't know either.
Sometimes that can be good, sometimes that can be bad. Initial questions or reactions or...
So when it says then explain the significance of madness, do they want madness worked in throughout the essay, or just a separate thing at the end of this line?
You mean kind of like structurally?
Yeah.
Like for a setup?
Do they want reasonable?
You don't even have to say that. You can say me because it's me.
Then do you want
I would say, off the top of my head, not to limit to it, I think there's probably 3 different potential structures that would work all equally well. So that's something that we'll definitely take a look at. So, not that you have to write this underneath, but I'm just kind of making notes for myself. Question about potential structure. To answer your question, I could see some folks doing this all within one specific paragraph, and probably like a final body paragraph. I could see some people incorporating it into all of the body paragraphs. One thing a factor that might determine what you want to do could be your last TWA that you did. If you were a person who you had no problem writing 3 body paragraphs, you probably could do a significance paragraph and save it at the end. If you were someone where you were watching the clock the whole time and you were concerned, am I going to be able to finish my second body paragraph? I wouldn't want to wait until my third body paragraph to hit the significance, because there's a potential that I might not be able to get there. So we'll go over some potential structures, should have plural, that you would use. But I think you kind of having a better gauge now as to what can I physically write in 40 minutes might influence the way that you want to approach it. But you'll, a definite aspect of the essay is going to be this, because that's kind of like the big second part, explain the significance of the madness. The first part is rationalizing the behavior that Holden does. And so you can judge it as being reasonable, and not to pigeonhole people. If you're sympathetic with Holden as a character, you probably will have a more likely chance to rationalize behavior. No, what he did probably wasn't good, but here's why it makes sense, or it's not necessarily the worst thing ever. If you're a person where Holden annoys me, please take this book. I don't ever want to look at it again. There's a decent chance then that you're not going to rationalize his behavior as being reasonable, because you're going to, under no circumstances should he be doing A, B, C, X, Y, and Z. I don't care where you fall with that, because that's your personal choice. Regardless of whether you find it to be reasonable or not, what you're doing in the second part is identifying and explaining why Salinger found it necessary to incorporate that madness into the work. How does that kind of fit into the bigger picture, the bigger scheme of things that he as an author is trying to accomplish? So, not going totally into potential structure, I could see, Sarah, you might decide that here's something that he does, not reasonable, but here's why it's important. And you do that all in one paragraph and keep going. Maybe Katie takes a look at all the irrational behavior. This is why he shouldn't do it. Here's more stuff that he shouldn't have done. And then wants to take a look at that all in one big encompassing paragraph at the end. There's no set formula really for any type of essay. There's no one way to write the essay. But it's trying to give you options to see what will work best for you. So we'll definitely hit that part. But do understand, that you have 2 tasks, that you got to take a look at. Do you agree with his behavior? Why is that behavior important to what the work's trying to do? What's an argument to stay away from so far as significance? He uses Holden's maddening behavior to make the book more interesting, or develop plot, or make him a more complete character. That's kind of, yes, it's true to an extent, but what's kind of like the big picture? So, good question. Just to give you an answer again. Anything else?
Are we allowed to say that, Holden may think that his actions are reasonable, but other people may see it as not?
Sure, so long as you still let us know where you fall with it.
Okay.
So, and I don't know if that's more likely if you, say you are defending something that he does. Here. Judging Holden's behavior. Abby, anything come to the front of your head as to this is something that other people might not look as being reasonable that he does? Or vice versa.
Not really. I was just
Okay. Do you think what would be some behaviors of Holden that would be in question? Let's put it that way.
How he is avoiding home the whole time, and he doesn't want to tell his parents what happened.
Okay.
He's just avoiding the problem.
So I'm going to put avoids problems for a specific reason here. Say, and I know you said home. Say that you do, because I'm just thinking of like things that we were talking about yesterday. Say you write one of his maddening behaviors is the fact that he's constantly trying to avoid problems and or confrontation, and you leave it at that. That's general. You know, you're probably taking a look at something within that 2 range on that 0 to 4 evidence commentary. What are specific things that he tries to avoid? You mentioned home, which is going to include parents. What are, and I'll say problems and thinking of problems and or confrontations. What are other things or people that he avoids so far as like confrontation or issues or problems? Specifically, home being one. It's like Virginia has the idea. He did the hamster arm.
It was, I think it was somebody's mother. It was somebody's mother who he didn't like. He didn't want to talk to.
With the phone calls
Yeah.
that he's doing. Where he'll like kind of hang up and being indecisive.
Yeah.
Maybe not a problem, but what's a confrontation that he definitely avoids early on, person-wise? And not speaking on the phone, but actually going to see Jane. And again, not that Jane would be a problem, but he doesn't want to confront Jane, or he's at least indecisive about confronting it. So, one is that since you mentioned avoiding, home or problems, if she were to simply write avoid problems, I'm going to write in the margin like what? Such as, question mark. If you were to go, he chronically avoids problems and confrontations, such as he's afraid to go home at times because what if his parents are there? Or he doesn't want to go to see Jane downstairs when Stradlater gets back because what if she ends up being different? Now you're giving more specific examples that are taking place. Abby, to your point, that you were going, you could argue that, yeah, Holden has a reason why he doesn't want to do these things, but that reason is really, you could use something like inexcusable, or Holden selfishly wants to avoid these things, and you using the word selfishly lets me know that you really don't agree with it. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with incorporating why he would do these things or why for him it would make sense. But we want to know, where do you fall on it? Is it something that, it's too immature of him to be avoiding all this kind of confrontation? If you don't want to talk to your parents about flunking out of school, then don't flunk out of school. If you don't want to go down and see Jane, don't say over and over again, I think I'm going to go down and see Jane. No, I don't think I'm going to, kind of thing. So as long as we know where you personally stand with it, that's fine. You could have some behaviors of his that you find normally would not be reasonable, but based on circumstances that have gone on in Holden's life, you can understand why he does it, and I would be okay with that. So it's not that you would be condoning behavior that he partakes in, but you can see why he would partake in it. And so in his extenuating circumstances, which we would hope, again, you'd go into some detail about, you could judge it as being reasonable because of what's happened to him, but normally you would not. So those are all certainly options that would be out there, but we just want to know, what is your stance? Where do you fall? What is your opinion? So just make sure you make your opinion clear. I don't think you need to use I, me, my in order to do that. I think his behavior is irrational. I think his behavior is wonderful. But if you go, he rightfully does these things, he wrongfully, I know exactly where you kind of fall with it.
Could you ever argue that, let's say, you think it's reasonable or not
Bless you.
reasonable because of the madness that he experiences? Or is that too much, not combining the 2 points?
So his maddening behavior would be reasonable because of his madness?
Kind of in a sense. Because, yeah, I don't know.
That makes me think of circular reasoning works because
Or just his actions are reasonable madness because it explains why he does what he does.
If, and again, knowing that these are, general terms here that we're throwing out here. So we got his madness. You could certainly take a look at things, elements that you think contribute to that madness, and therefore that is why it has to be, not, I shouldn't say has to be, but why it can be judged as reasonable. For example, what would be some things that make Holden act the way that Holden acts? Besides the adult in the room going, he's a stupid teenager, because that's a generalization, I can't say that.
He wants to see a lot more mature feelings.
Okay.
He always tries to like constant children. He tries to act like older than he's actually.
So that kind of like desire to protect children and that innocence idea? Okay, another factor.
His refusal to deal with Allie's death.
So I'm going to put Allie's death, but yeah, you could have like the refusal to cope with it, the inability to cope with it, maybe the lack of, I don't want to just say conversation, but as a family, potentially, and we don't know for sure, the lack of therapy, conversation, things to try to deal with it.
Yeah, like his parents' negligence with the fact that like he clearly does not want to go to like boarding school, but they're not listening and keep sending him off. I can see why he wouldn't want to go.
And I'll stop there since I drew 3 arrows, so that works. So to like, and I don't know if this completely answers the way that you were thinking, but you could go that these things have contributed to like that maddening behavior, and because of that negligence or because of that death, because of that, conflict of maturity, immaturity, where he wants to protect children's innocence, it's reasonable that he acts the way that he does. Yes, you could certainly do that. At the same time, I could see people going, just because someone maybe wasn't there for you the way that you wanted him to, doesn't mean that you should flunk out of school, smoke cigarettes every chance you get, try to order alcohol all the time, threaten to run off to Colorado and live your life as a deaf mute. So you could certainly go that yes, the cards are stacked against him, but that doesn't give you an escape clause that you can do whatever the heck it is that you want to do. I could see, not to argue with what Emily wrote, or not wrote, but like mentioned up here, I could see some folks going, his desire to protect children and innocence is wonderful, so why are you trying to hit on parents in trains? What does that have to do with, a desire of yours or things like that, where these things don't match up? So just because a person mentions these doesn't mean that you have to defend it, nor does it mean that, you cannot defend it or whatever the case may be. Do you want to touch base on structure? I want to try to start doing that today. Anything else about the wording of the prompt that's going to be confusing for folks, where you're unsure of what it is I have to do? Again, you can, you're not quoting and you're not using the book, but that doesn't mean that you can't have specific examples. So us talking about, him hitting on Mrs. Morrow, or, on the train, or, negligence of parents because it doesn't seem that there's any kind of specific conversation taking place. Holden talking to Phoebe about his desire to protect children and be the catcher in the rye. Those are all specific references that you can work into the essay naturally without having to have page numbers, next to it at any point. So, assuming that you're going to have an introduction, and in that introduction, you're also going to have a what? Because we want that 1 point. Easiest way to not get the thesis is to like not make a decision. And so his behavior could be judged as reasonable, but it could not be judged as reasonable. Make a call as to what it is that you want to do. I would say within the thesis, you probably want to do 2 things. Is it reasonable? Answer that question, and then also is it, or not is it, but explain how it is significant to the work. If you feel that for you, you have to break this down into 2 sentences, I'm okay with that. If you can do it all in 1 sentence, that's wonderful. But if it's easier for you to go, Holden's behavior throughout the course of the book is erratic and maddening, it cannot be judged as reasonable, period. However, Holden's madness does play an important role in the significance of the work because Salinger wants to, ... That's perfectly fine. You don't have to use a semicolon, to make it all one big sentence. If you want to go with a 2-sentence compound thesis concept, you're absolutely okay with that. Someone was asking a couple days ago, can you have a 2-sentence thesis? And I said, sure, because I knew you were going to have one of these things coming down the road here with this DWA. Right? Sarah, I'm going to go to you since you were kind of asking about structure. Are you thinking of anything in your mind as to this is how I think I want to do it?
I think I'm gonna do the not reasonable route.
Okay.
Primarily because kind of what you were talking about, yes, all these things are stacked against him, but that doesn't mean that you go and just think about people committing suicide all the time or blocks and blocks on end with no.
So you're going to go unreasonable. Rather than me asking, I'll just say, you could do a couple things where in 2-body paragraphs, you identify unreasonable behaviors. Parenthesis around the because you might end up doing reasonable behaviors, okay? You know that since it's argument-based, you want to try to have some specific evidence that's going to take place. To avoid this from kind of just being a whole clunk of different types of behaviors that could be going on, I would try to find some general terms that you would want to use that why you find that behavior is going to be reasonable or unreasonable. I'm freezing up here, so hopefully we can reload. So, it could be avoiders, things of that nature, where that's your general terminology that you're going to use. Then you're able to go into specific details as to what those, the avoidance of confrontation, what those destructive behaviors are, but at least of behaviors that you can take a look at. So I decide that we're going to take a look at avoids confrontation and that he does things that are self-destructive. Purposely, these are kind of what? So far as detail. General. They're vague. They're like categories. So it's imagery, diction, kind of having those things. Which is good for a thesis statement. The fact that Holden avoids confrontation and commits self-destructive behaviors proves that his actions are unreasonable. It's pretty clear, okay, what I'm taking a look at. Then, this is when you would give yourself the option of details. So you could get specific examples of what would be some self-destructive behavior and what would be some things that he does to avoid confrontation. A potential question that Abby is going to ask, how many details do I need per body paragraph? Because Abby likes things to be symmetrical and planned out to a T. Usually. Yeah. Which is good. Mrs. Kane's that way. She's all about symmetry. I would try to say at least 2. Okay? There's no set rule and whatnot with it. I wouldn't want it to be, he avoids confrontation because he doesn't see Jane, and then that's the only thing that happens. The nice thing would be that you're trying to get some encompassing examples so that you can see how this continues to show up throughout the course of the book. But you could go right here, first body paragraph, his behavior is unreasonable because he avoids confrontation. Here's some examples. Second body paragraph, his behavior is unreasonable, self-destructive. Here are some details that you get into. What part of the prompt am I still missing at this point? I haven't explained well, I'll assume that these details will be the evidence, that I'm specifically going to get into. And I have to make sure that I provide that commentary as to why that self-destructive behavior is unreasonable. So you can't simply go, an example of his self-destructive behavior that's unreasonable is alcohol, and just leave it at that, assuming that the reader's going to follow along with you. Provide that commentary as to why that example ends up being, unreasonable. So, assuming that these details are specific, I'll have that evidence and commentary. What I don't have yet is significance to the meaning of the work as a whole. If I do this in my first body paragraph, this in my second, what I could then do in a third body paragraph is take all of this stuff that I've talked about, and now I'm going to explain the significance to the work as a whole. What name am I probably going to use the most in body paragraphs 1 and 2? Holden. Okay? Because you're going to be writing about Holden does this, Holden does that. This is a Holden paragraph. This is a Holden paragraph. What name will I probably use the most when it comes to that explain the significance to the meaning of the work as a whole? That's going to be a Salinger paragraph, all right? And last week, we did a soapstone for Salinger. That soapstone sheet that you have might be a resource that you would want to take a look at when it comes to what's the overall significance that he is trying to get across. So, what's this with his purpose? How does this kind of fit in with the era, the occasion that he's living in? How could this kind of be relevant to the audience that he is trying to write to? That could all be happening in this third body paragraph. So that would be an option. If you successfully did 3 body paragraphs last week on Friday, this very well could be an option that you would want to do. What if you didn't successfully write 3 paragraphs? Because you don't have to successfully write 3 paragraphs. How could you still accomplish the same thing in 2?
Just kind of get rid of that.
Ideally, I don't want to get rid of this completely because then I'm going to be losing like a fair chunk of evidence. So I don't want to completely get rid of it. Hannah?
Combine them.
You combine which?
Body paragraph 1 and 2.
You could combine 1 and 2. A concern that I might have, and that is an option, so again, it's not going, don't do this, is for some people, and you know the way that you think, that might be too much going on in one body paragraph, that I'm not going to keep everything organized. Now, in defense of yourselves, you can write notes down on the prompt ahead of time, so you might be able to certainly do that. What I'm thinking that you could do is, here's his unreasonable behavior. He avoids confrontation. He shouldn't do it, or it's okay that he does. Here's the details. Then there's a sentence. However, yet, this is what Salinger's trying to do with it. So you could have Salinger show up over here. You could then have Salinger show up over here and be in those same body paragraphs. It's not cutting back on ideas. I do think it would be cutting back on some words a little bit because you're not introducing topics again and things like that. For some folks, kind of like I just said to Hannah, it might be too much going on if you combine 1 and 2. For some folks, it could be too much if I'm combining Holden's behavior, this is how I judge it, and this is why Salinger's going about and doing it. Structurally, it does make sense, and it would be symmetrical. So this would be Mrs. Kane approved because my 2 body paragraphs would look the same, but she's not going to read it anyway. But that might be a lot of stuff going on in 1 paragraph. I don't care what you do as long as you kind of meet those. I don't think many people would do this, but I could also see folks going 1 paragraph, here's all his behaviors. 2nd body paragraph, this is why it's reasonable or not reasonable. 3rd body paragraph, here's the overall significance of it with what Salinger wants to do. So those are kind of like the 3 main structures that I was kind of thinking of in my head.
For the thesis, is it too vague to say like Holden's erratic and delusional behavior, or do you want us to specifically say, Holden's avoidance of going home, his attitude is this? Because I don't want to be
At the risk of like making this sound like a pinky swear and then like you attacking me, in a week and a half from now, I would say if you were to do something like that, like his erratic behavior, you'd be okay. You could get a checkpoint for the thesis.
Yeah.
If you spell out not the specific behaviors, but because he avoids confrontation and self-destructive behavior, this is why it's reasonable or unreasonable. Now you're taking a look at like that check plus,
Okay, so it's better.
for the thesis because it's stronger. Regardless, though, and this is where I don't want you like coming back and yelling at me, but I said this is his behavior. How dare you? In that second sentence, or that second part of the thesis, make sure you do highlight what that significance is. I wouldn't keep that in my back pocket as, hey, here's some suspense. I'm not going to tell you why it's significant until we get there. When we did the Kurtz TWA, a lot of folks, again, it was their first TWA, it was like, diction and details, blah, 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 characterize Kurtz. Where the stronger ones characterize Kurtz as, and then it was giving what that characterization would be. I would say the same things here, where specify what that significance is. So if you're specifying types of behavior and what that overall significance is, now that's looking like a really strong thesis statement.
Okay.
Virginia, do we need to write a note on the board so we remember your question for tomorrow? You had a hand up
I'll
too.
remember it.
Okay. So again, we're still talking about this tomorrow. You're not writing an essay tomorrow, but you could certainly kind of start to think about some things you want to look at, and we might be able to discuss how that can work out.